Welcome, everyone. This is the third meeting in this three-part course on EcoDharma, and I'm very grateful to be here with all of you, both live and in terms of a recording if you're watching this later. I'm very grateful that we've had the chance to organize these little course. In the past, we've run some longer ones with Tibet House, and I've also had the great privilege of organizing shorter events on many occasions as well. And every time I am amazed by how, on the one hand, vast this field of Eco-Dharma really is, because it includes basically the entirety of Buddhism and the entirety of environmentalism within it. And also amazed by how, as a society or as a global community, in a way, we are still making our very first steps with regards to this whole dimension of spiritual practice and worldly activity, we could say. Yes, of course, there are many people who are very deeply involved in the Dharmic traditions, whether that's Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, or really any other type of Dharma. There's Dharma of secular humanism, there's Christian Dharma. We just don't usually use that term, but in a way, there are, of course, spiritual teachings that protect us from suffering within Christianity. So, from that point of view, there is Christian Dharma, there's Muslim Dharma, and so forth. So, there are people who are very deeply involved with that. And of course, there's so many incredible activists, naturalists, scientists, and so forth on this planet who are very deeply involved in the study and protection of nature. And yet, it's in the connecting of these two domains that we are lagging behind in a way. And the reason for why we could be spending our time connecting these two fields is that, and that's a working hypothesis, it seems like we can only succeed in fully protecting the natural world from our own greed, aversion, and ignorance, the three fires that we discussed in our very first meeting, if we are able to perform a major shift in our view of reality collectively. And this is where such fields as Eco-Dharma can play a crucial role. But to succeed in the practice and study of them, we really need to spend some time doing that. So that's where I think there's a lot of complex feelings that people have, including the reluctance to even contemplate these topics, and a sense of fear, dread, anxiety, climate-related anxiety, and so forth that some people experience, which once again prevents us from looking at this with greater courage, and sometimes also just the sense of urgency with regards to other issues in our life. We feel that our emotional problems maybe are more important right now, our emotional problems in communicating with others or in dealing with our work, or issues that we see as more political than the this whole field of environmentalism. Yeah, like yes, nature is important, but there are things currently burning in the political field in my country or in the world at large. So I'll focus on that. So there are many reasons we find why the study of nature and our relationship with the rest of the natural world can be postponed. And yet, in my experience, actually diving into this field can be incredibly healing for all the other aspects of our life. It can be healing for our personal, emotional field, or emotional body, as Tsoknyi Rinpoche likes to call it. It can be very transformative in terms of our view of politics. It can be profoundly beneficial for our relationships with others, because in a way we're learning the same principles of seeing clearly and attending kindly. And yeah, hopefully, if you've been with us for the past couple of weeks and you've had the time to do the practices that we looked at, hopefully you've already experienced a little bit of a transformation there, a little bit of a shift in terms of how deeply you're able to rest with the first practice that we were working with, or how strongly you can soothe yourself, and in terms of how kindly you can attend and how clearly you can see. And that was the second practice that we were doing, the horizontal and vertical extension of loving kindness and compassion. So right now, as we begin, we'll just do a brief review of our previous practices and our previous conversations, and then we'll discuss the third part that has to do with supporting the healing or restorative dynamics that can affect our world positively. So we began with a look at our personal relationship with the natural world. And just to use a relatively simple keyword, sort of a hashtag that we could apply to the dimension of our practice in that regard, I was mentioning the word soothing. And there are, of course, many other words that we could use, and there are much more elaborate descriptions that we could follow. But for simplicity, in a way, the very first step that we can take to make sure that we're properly prepared to be of service to the global interdependence of which we are a part, the very first step that we could take is to make sure that we ourselves are relatively balanced internally and in terms of the threads of interdependence that connect us to the rest of reality. And because many of us don't feel balanced simply because we are agitated, simply because we constantly move between the two attentional extremes of laxity and excitation, because we constantly move between the two emotional extremes of emotional hyperactivity and emotional deficit, and so forth, because there are so many internal imbalances that we could discover within our own field of being. uh, it is of benefit to initially apply the teachings or the practices uh, suggested by such great masters of the past as the Buddha and his followers that could bring in that greater sense of balance. And although we could potentially list thousands of such practices, even within the Buddhist tradition alone, not to mention many more that could come from other great contemplative traditions, we, for the sake of simplicity, but also for the sake of fullness, started working with a method that was originally taught by a number of great masters of the past. In the Indo-Tibetan contemplative tradition, and Tibet House is a major learning center for that tradition in New York City and now online. In the Indo-Tibetan contemplative tradition, there is this wonderful practice that sometimes, by some translators, including Alan Wallace, is referred to as settling our body, speech, and mind in the natural state. Sometimes the Tibetan term rangpap is used, meaning kind of self-settling or self-putting down. And this practice in the Indo-Tibetan tradition probably was first taught in Tibet itself by the great master Padmasambhava, because he was the originator for the first wave of translations that occurred in Tibet approximately in the 8th, 9th centuries. So when he was introducing advanced teachings on the nature of the mind, he brought in this preparatory practice, and it has been applied ever since. The essence of that practice is to let our body rest deeply with no activity, to let our speech rest deeply with no activity, and to let our mind rest deeply with no activity. One reason to apply this mode of inactivity, one reason to practice this is because it helps us gradually deactivate the coarser levels of our mind, which prepares us for experiencing the deepest nature of our own awareness, which in Buddhist terms is a direct path to liberating ourselves from negative mental traits by coming into contact with our deeper nature, establishing a contact to our deeper true nature that goes well beyond the confines of this temporary personality that we now identify ourselves with. We are moving beyond the destructive mental states, but we're still retaining all the positive mental states. We will still be loving and kind and compassionate and empathetic and so forth. In fact, more so, because those states, the states that are described as quote unquote positive, such as love and compassion and tenderness and so forth, are actually in our own or already embedded in our own true nature. Whereas the destructive mental states, since they're coming from a misunderstanding of reality, misinterpretation of reality, these states gradually dissolve and disappear. So that's the main reason for doing this type of practice. It is a preparation for eventually recognizing our true nature and being able to rest in that extensively. But on a more mundane level, or we could say on a more practical level related to our day-to-day interaction with the rest of reality, there are many other reasons for doing a practice like this. One of them is that through resting deeply, we will just recover some of our energy, and not just our physical energy. Tsoknyi Rinpoche sometimes talks about three dimensions in which we can accidentally go over our speed limit. One of them is physical. We can overextend ourselves physically by doing too much too fast, running around too much or exercising excessively or just working too hard for many hours and then feeling exhausted. Very obviously, we overextend ourselves physically. That's the thing. Maybe it happens less than it used to, at least in the richest countries. It happens less than it used to, let's say, in the times of Charles Dickens. But it still happens all over the world all the time. So that's one thing where we might be one dimension of our being where we can benefit from a deep sense of rest, the physical domain. The second domain is the intellectual domain. We can also overextend ourselves there. Let's say we are tasked by our bosses with doing something intellectually challenging, and we work on that very challenging intellectual task or a number of tasks or a number of hours, and eventually our intellect just starts to get more dull because we're too tired in the intellectual field. It's really becoming hard to focus and perform those complex cognitive tasks because our mind, in with regards to this intellectual level, needs some rest. So that's another dimension of our being that can benefit from deep restfulness. But Tsoknyi Rinpoche, when talking about this, and he talks about it this in his oral teachings a lot, but also in his latest book, Why We Meditate, which is a wonderful book that he co-authored with Daniel Goleman. And Daniel Goleman's providing some scientific info there just to motivate us to do these meditation practices that Tsoknyi Rinpoche is teaching. So Tsoknyi Rinpoche in that book and in many, many other teachings and in some of his previous books as well mentions the fact that we can also go over our speed limit in our emotional domain or the domain of feelings more elaborately, to describe it more elaborately. It's not just our emotions, it's also our feelings, it's also our moods, kind of everything that's in between pure cognition and the physicality of our being. So it's in that domain where we can just emotionally feel too much pressure, or where we can feel too much emotional pressure, or we can feel the sense of being too speedy, too activated, trying to do too much at the same time. And intellectually, we can be at rest, relatively speaking, and not doing anything complex cognitively. Physically, we can be not overextended either. I walk around, I move a little bit, but I'm not doing anything that complex. But emotionally, while our intellect and our body are not engaged very heavily, emotionally, we can be very heavily engaged. And that can occur for a number of reasons. One of them being that we simply exist in a society, now globally speaking, that expects a lot of us. Um, just this morning, I saw an internet meme that said, "Oh, sorry, I missed your message. Um, I'm constantly being bombarded by multiple sources of information with a brain that's designed to eat berries in a cave. So kind of historically, we were not meant to receive that many messages, all over the internet and experience so many emotional reactions to what's happening all over the world. And yet here we are. So that can be pretty heavy on our system. And so in this emotional domain, we also need periods of depressed. So one of the personal benefits related to our day-to-day life of doing a practice such as settling body, speech, and mind is that this practice allows our physical, cognitive, and feeling domains to rest deeply and once again recuperate. And then one more benefit that we have discussed in our first class was that when we do a practice of deeply resting, of deeply unwinding in a natural environment, and in fact, eventually we start recognizing that every environment is a natural environment. Every environment is built of the five elements, um, the Buddhists would say. So we're always surrounded by nature, but more so when we are surrounded by nature in a way where we can recognize a major strong presence of the elements. Let's say we're sitting next to a river, we're in a park, we're under a tree, we're in the hills, and so forth. When we are in those environments, and eventually when we are in all environments, when we do this practice, and then we open up to the positive influence, the balancing influence of the natural world, the elements themselves can directly or indirectly affect us. They can nourish us. And this is where the Tibetan tradition has a whole elaborate science related to it of how different elements can support us in different ways. So we could be uh, next to a river, which obviously is a major expression of the water element, and resting deeply while connecting to that river or just being peripherally aware of that, we can strengthen our experience of comfort because the element of water is strongly associated with comfort and okayness in the present moment. When we lack stability in terms of how we feel, we could go and connect more deeply to the earth element through being in the mountains, sitting next to a hill, uh, and so forth. We could find different expressions of the earth element around us. When we feel like we're lacking joy and passion, it would be good to reconnect to the fire element. That could be done once again in a number of ways. If you can go to a volcano, great. Just be careful. But outside of that, the sun is a great source of the fire element, and also sitting next to a bonfire could, or you know, an indoor source of fire as well, even a candle in some cases. Those can also provide the same kind of elemental push if we truly open up to it. Then the air element would be a major source of kind of intellectual flexibility. If we sometimes feel stuck intellectually, we feel like we don't have solutions for the problems that we're facing. It feels like creatively we are unable to flex our mind enough. It's just not enough movement internally. We kind of feel stuck. This is where the air element would be of great support. And we can be in a windy place, sitting on a hill and feeling that breeze. Um, or we can be anywhere where movement of air is clearly noticeable, allowing ourselves to kind of absorb that through just resting deeply once again. And finally, the element of space itself, which is kind of more of a negation in a way, just the absence of obstruction. That's how it's defined. The element of space could be great if we feel that our life has too much happening in it and we don't have enough space for all of that. So sometimes if we feel, and I think many people feel that way in many cases, if we feel that, oh, I have so much to do, and I don't have enough emotional space for all of it, or intellectual space, or even physical space. Connecting to the element of space, but just sitting in front of a major spacious environment, a big, chunk of space in front of us, and connecting to that through our attention, that could help us connect to that quality and then feel, oh, yes, I do have enough space for all these 3 things I have to do today, or 33 things, or 300 things. Sometimes it's actually not that much that we have to do, but we still feel overextended. And sometimes we have so many things, and yet we're doing them with such grace and ease. So the difference between these 2 things from this element oriented point of view would be dependent on whether we have connected deeply to the space element and it is balanced. It is in a state of balance with all the other 5, with the rest of the elements, with the other 4. So that's a practice that we can do. And in our first meeting, we were discussing it in terms of a threefold schema that's presented and promoted by a master of the Tibetan Pön tradition, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. So the Pön tradition traces its origins to a different Buddha, whereas the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, also known sometimes as the Nalanda tradition, traces itself back to Buddha Shakyamuni or Siddhartha Gautama, the great Indian prince that most of us are familiar with in terms of his life story. The Pön tradition traces itself back to the Buddha by the name of Shenrab Rinpoche, who lived reportedly in Central Asia much earlier on. And it's through his inspirational teachings and the teachings of the subsequent master that the Pön tradition eventually formed. The Nalanda tradition of Buddhism and the Pön tradition have affected each other quite strongly over the course of history. And some of their branches look very, very close to each other. They also share a lot of practices and methods. They share a lot of foundational philosophical ideas, including the idea of emptiness, including the ethical idea of bodhicitta, and so forth. So these 2 traditions are as close to each other, I think, as 2 distinct religious or spiritual traditions could ever be. And so it is of no surprise that the Pön tradition equally carries this practice of settling body, speech, and mind. And when teaching it to Westerners these days, once again, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche likes to call it the practice of the 3 pills. And his joke about it is that Americans love pills, so he started calling it the practice of 3 pills. So, yeah, um, you know, I'm just conveying his message. And the idea is that these 3 pills, like normal pills that we might be taking, can affect us positively, hopefully. With the regular pills, hopefully there would be some benefit and not much harm. So with these 3 pills that Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche is teaching here, equally, they're probably going to affect us positively. So the 3 pills are stillness, silence, and spaciousness. Stillness of the body, silence of our speech, and spaciousness of our mind. So for our body, when we focus on it initially, we relax it deeply and we allow it to rest in a state of stillness. And of course, it's a relative type of stillness because our body is still breathing and our heart is still beating. But even this relative stillness can be quite healing for us in terms of our ability to let go of our neurotic physical habits and also our neurotic thoughts related to our body. So resting in stillness physically, then for our speech, resting in silence or inactivity, verbal inactivity for a while. And for our mind, resting in a state of spaciousness, which means that we're not allowing ourselves to over-identify with any of our thoughts or other types of mental activity. It's as if, and this is once again straight from Wangyal Rinpoche, it's as if we were focusing on the space in our inner room instead of the furniture in our inner room. So if our thoughts and stories, and even our sense of identity, if all of that is like furniture, because that's the content, in this practice, we kind of just remain uninterested in all of those things, rather looking out into the vast spaciousness of our own mind. And yes, it does sound a bit cryptic when we first hear about it, but over time, as we keep practicing with this, as we keep deepening our experiences of stillness and silence, the spaciousness element will also become much more clear. And then once we have kind of understood what's meant here experientially, this practice becomes a major part of our repertoire, both as a preparation, as a way of preparing ourselves for any other practice, and that's how Padmasambhava taught it back in the day, and as a fully transformative practice on its own. And within the domain of EcoDharma, we can use it once again in order to prepare ourselves for any type of activity, positive activity that we might be doing, in order to deepen our experience of kind of the spiritual domain of reality, in order to recover or nourish our body, speech, and mind, and in order to connect to the natural elements more deeply, which would lead directly and indirectly to the transformational shift that we're going to focus on today, which is the greening of the self, as Joanna Macy calls it. So for all these reasons, this is a wonderful practice. It can also be very therapeutic, and Wangel Rinpoche has a whole book on the therapeutic effects of it. Once again, that book is called True Source of Healing. True Source of Healing. And it's a wonderful book, little book, I should say. It's relatively short. A wonderful book that unpacks this transformational process of regaining our vitality within in the different aspects of our life. So in Tibetan, this process is called laguk, kind of hooking, rehooking, hooking, like with a hook, are la. And in that book, Wangel Rinpoche translates la as a soul, just because in anthropology, there's already this set expression of soul retrieval. Soul retrieval is a practice that seems to be present across the multiple shamanic traditions in the world, I think including Siberian shamanism, and the word shaman itself mainly comes from the study of Eurasian shamanism. But of course, now we apply it to multiple spiritual indigenous traditions across the world, including the Bon tradition. So just because there's this set expression in anthropology, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche uses it as his translation choice for Laguk. But La is not a kind of a permanent soul. It's not our soul in the Christian sense of that word. It's not the immortal part of our being that would eventually move on to another plane of reality and abide there in bliss or in suffering. La is kind of a vital essence that we possess that informs our state of being. If our La is balanced and strong, we feel good. If our La is depleted, for different reasons, we kind of feel bad. That's the essence of it. And the Tibetan tradition actually speaks of several aspects of our being that all need to be strongly present and well nourished for us to feel good. There's this concept of La. There's a concept of vitality or tse, and they're different things that could be translated in different ways. And ideally, we have all of them present in our being and well balanced. So Wang Rinpoche argues, and that's a working hypothesis that we can all check, that through resting deeply in the three pills, still in silence and spaciousness, we would replenish our La and heal our relationship with the natural world, with ourselves, with others, with our body. So the book goes through these categories chapter by chapter. And in my experience, people who feel kind of like they are in need of some healing, psychologically or even physically, there's kind of some roughness about our experience right now. And for that reason, we don't feel very resourced to be of service right now, which is valid. For people who are feeling that temporarily, that's a good book to explore. I've seen it help many beings. There are, of course, many other approaches that we could benefit from. There are similar sequences of practices described in Why We Meditate by Tsoknor Rinpoche and many other sources. But True Source of Healing is a good place to start, amongst others. So let's do a brief practice of the three pills. And then with that, we'll move on to the kind of our review of the second part. So stretching a little bit, if we feel like stretching, if we feel like we need to kind of move our body, move our energies, or drink some water before we meditate, just to prepare ourselves for that. And also assuming the position that we ourselves right now feel is the best. So for some people, it might be a supine position, just lying flat on your back in Shavasana, if that's what you prefer. Many of us probably would choose to meditate in the upright position, sitting with our legs crossed or with our feet flat on the ground. You can keep your camera on or off depending on what's more comfortable. If it's off, you're kind of in a little retreat bubble right now. If it's on, you're sharing your presence generously. Either way is great. And then with that, once we have assumed that position, we can start preparing ourselves for practice by bringing our attention to the body and just noticing what's happening there. First, bringing our awareness to the body and starting to observe the physical sensations there. In particular, noticing the contact between our body and the ground that's holding us, and the sensations of stability, firmness, steadiness in the parts of the body that are touching the ground, in our feet and toes, in our legs, in our buttocks. Starting to release the tension while being clearly aware of all the sensations, all of the sensations in these areas. Equally, applying the same process of relaxation combined with clear awareness to our hands and fingers, to our pelvic floor, our shoulders, and our face. Then, extending our awareness to the entirety of the body and noticing that our body is right now relatively still. There are probably different types of movement here and there. Our breath is moving, our heart is beating, but underneath all of that is a deep sense of restful stillness that we can relax into and that we can be aware of. And that's exactly what we do. We rest in stillness and we are aware of the stillness, moment by moment. Our speech is already resting in a state of silence. We're not saying anything right now. We're not reciting anything. We're also not using electronic speech. We're not typing right now and so forth. So we've already dealt with those two domains in a way easily. But for some of us, there still might be inner dialogue happening. We might still be talking to ourselves mentally, and that's also an expression of speech. But if we start attending to the underlying quality of silence and relaxing into it, releasing, letting go, maybe with each exhalation, this inner speech will also eventually settle down. So, this is what we're doing right now. We are resting in silence and we're aware of the silence, moment by moment, relaxing more and more deeply into it. One way to describe it is to say we become a giant listening device that is attending to silence at the root of all sounds. With our entire being, we're listening to inner and outer silence right now. And on the level of our mind, even though there are many thoughts that are probably coming up, at least on occasion, even though they're mental images, desires, impulses, emotions, and so forth, all of that, our mind also always has the quality of spaciousness to it. And that's where we can direct our attention temporarily, releasing our grasping at the individual mental events and simply being aware of the fact that our mind is spacious, not limited to anything in particular, to any particular mental event, and always cognizant, always aware. We'll rest in this experience of spaciousness or an approximation of spaciousness for just 1 minute. Then we come back to our body, just noticing its current experiences, noticing also its position in space, noticing how it feels, and then introducing a tiny bit of movement to the body by rocking back and forth, moving our fingers, opening our eyes, reactivating our facial muscles, and then slowly concluding by coming back to the space around us. Thank you. So, um, I'll say a few more words about the importance of this practice in the context of EcoDharma. But while I'm doing that, I would invite all of you to use the chat and to share just a few words about how this practice makes you feel. Either right now, if this was your first time doing it, or your only time doing it, or if you've done it in the past, you can share the experiences you've had with it in the past. Yeah, or when you were training in it in our first week of the course. So really, it could be 2 words, or it can be 2 sentences, or it could be anything, because I'm always curious about people's experiences. And also actually sharing your experience is really beneficial in terms of being able to become more aware of your practice and its qualities and its transformative effect. So while you're doing that, just another thought related to why we might be doing this practice in the first place. I've already mentioned that traditionally, this practice was taught as a practice that can lead to liberation or serve as a preparation for practices that liberate, right? So that's why Padmasambhava taught it. he, being a great visionary and a greatly realized master, as followers of the Indo-Tibetan tradition believe, he might have foreseen that we would also be using it to soothe our nervous systems in this day and age. Absolutely. Uh, but the main reason for why he taught it, probably, and that's the context within which it's described in the traditional source literature, was to prepare us for the advanced practices that can liberate our mind, leading us to the states of liberation and enlightenment. So, is there a connection between that and EcoDharma? Yes, because as we have discussed in the very first meeting, referencing an article or an essay by Bhikkhu Bodhi, one of the most celebrated translators of Pali literature, and one of the senior most monastics in the West. We were referencing an essay by Bhikkhu Bodhi and a teaching by the Buddha himself that Bhikkhu Bodhi just unpacks. We were referencing all of that and talking about how we could trace the source of all the environmental issues that we're facing right now, global pollution, overproduction, overconsumption, all of those things, back to the so-called three fires that the Buddha talked about in the fire sermon or the fire discourse. So, what are the three fires? They are the three fundamental distortions present in our mind. They're not in the nature of our mind, but they're present in our mind temporarily, and they affect us lifetime to lifetime by making us suffer and forcing us to bring suffering to each other. So, those are the fundamental one, ignorance or fundamental misinterpretation of reality. Attachment, which is the part of us that grasps on the basis of exaggeration, exaggerating the positive qualities of something and then wanting to possess it. And that's what leads us to overconsumption and to all sorts of negative behavior, including boundless greed, for example, including boundless corporate greed. And then the third one is aversion, where we, under the influence of attachment, exaggerate the negatives or something, and then we want to push that away. And yes, that can be expressed as violent types of activity, but on a more subtle level, it's this same aversion that makes us truly averse to boredom or simply lack of stimulation. We become truly uncomfortable with not being stimulated. We want to push that state away, and so we keep entertaining ourselves in an attempt to keep boredom away. And we mostly keep entertaining ourselves through consuming outer stuff. We don't keep boredom at bay by diving into the blissful nature of our own mind. That's not what our culture is teaching us to do. It would be great if that was the solution, if everyone in junior school was taught to go deep into the states of samadhi and just bliss out there. You don't need any stimulation from the outside, just, rest in the nature of your own mind, or at least in a deeper state of concentration, and you will find all the bliss there. It would be incredible if that was taught. But in our culture, that's not what's being taught. This was the case for some of the contemplative cultures of the world. We are not currently a contemplative culture in terms of just how cultural processes are unfolding in our shared informational field of information. So we are taught something else. We are told that in order to entertain ourselves, we have to well, at least have a few gadgets and mostly scroll through them and then also buy stuff on them. And then that stuff will get delivered and we'll wear it for 2 days and then we'll buy something else and the global wheel, the hedonic treadmill, as it's sometimes called. So for that reason, obviously, there's a direct connection between what's happening to the natural world and the natural resources and the biosphere and so forth, and these three fires within us. So when we rest in a practice, such as the practice of the three pills, we are naturally letting go of the three fires. We are unlearning them. And we will be able to unlearn them more deeply if we take this practice to a truly profound level. And that can happen if we train in the foundational aspects of it, and then we start working with a truly qualified master of the more advanced teachings on the nature of the mind. So if we ever encounter a truly qualified, I want to emphasize these words very carefully, truly qualified master of Dzogchen, the great perfection, or Mahamudra, the great seal, then with the help of such a teacher, we would be able to truly learn how to use this very practice of settling body, speech, and mind in order to rest in our true deepest nature. And when we're resting in it, when we recognize it, and when we're resting in it, our three fires become smaller and smaller, and then eventually, in the long run, will fully disappear. So, to the degree that we're able to limit the three fires within ourselves, we're able to limit the destructive activity that is affecting the world negatively. And that's still on the personal level. Inner transformation leading to outer transformation. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has this slogan that he often refers to of inner peace, world peace. So inner peace leading to world peace. And it's not something trivial or something that we just say and then don't think about it profoundly. No, this is an actually profound psychological statement. If we're able to curb, to tame the three fires within us, the entire field of interdependence around us gets affected by that, both in terms of how our personal activity unfolds and in terms of how we affect the activity of others. So becoming these pillars of goodness, pillars of freedom from the three fires. It's kind of a negation of something, or becoming pillars of wisdom and compassion, and those are the opposites of the three fires. That is something that will be truly transformative for the environmental dimension in which we all also abide. So some masters, some of my teachers focus primarily on that, on how we do desperately need this inner revolution to occur in as many individuals as possible, because through that, all of those individuals that have undergone transformation will become pillars of EcoDharma in a way by spreading wisdom and compassion and acting in a very enlightened way. So it's curbing of the three fires, the curbing of the three fires, the taming of the three fires that is one more, that provides us with one more reason to do this practice. Even a foundation level of this practice will have an effect on that. Okay, let's see what you said here in the chat. I just want to read it all out for, to provide that inspiration to future generations. You never know who might come across these recordings and watch them, which is why I'm so grateful to be doing this course and recording it together with all of you. So may they be inspired by what you've shared. So observation number one, it was very relaxing and very much needed because of the speediness I was feeling before. Thank you so much. In the spaciousness stage, I imagined an open nature scene in the mountains. Yeah, well, wonderful. Yes, these metaphors, like the sky, an open vista, and so forth, they provide us with a reference for what we're doing in the spaciousness stage. And while we're not meant to focus on those images, we're not concentrating on them, we're not visualizing consistently. Just briefly recalling the metaphor can reintroduce us to the experience of spaciousness that we're looking for. So this metaphor briefly comes to mind, and then we drop it, but we remember what is it that we're meant to do. It is as if we're looking out into the open sky instead of focusing on the clouds. It's as if we're looking out into the vast vista instead of focusing on the individual trees and so forth. Yeah. Observation number two, for me, it's much easier to focus on stillness and silence. When I'm trying to focus on spaciousness, I'm afraid that I'm simply dull or looking into dullness instead of looking into the space. That's very valid, and that's a common experience in the beginning stages of this practice, meaning when we're just learning to do it. And it might take us a while to become more comfortable with spaciousness. So it's totally natural to initially want to focus on stillness or silence more. Totally valid. We can spend months, if not years, just primarily working with those. But also, there's something fun about kind of still playing with spaciousness, even if we feel uncomfortable with it initially. And one way to make sure that we're not simply resting in dullness is to recognize through experience, maybe, that dullness actually is also a cloud. It's not the space itself. Dullness is also a temporary veil over spaciousness. And when we start discerning dullness as a cloud, we kind of start recognizing dullness as a cloud. Sometimes when we feel strong dullness or laxity, and we recognize, oh, that's kind of more like a filter that covers my view and not the actual spaciousness that I'm looking out into. When we recognize that, it becomes much easier to not fall under the influence of dullness. And kind of we will also become more comfortable with spaciousness when, through working with stillness and silence, our mind becomes more clear and therefore less prone, less prone to experiencing dullness. So that's another thing that will happen. So not to be afraid of playing with it, doing at least brief periods of spaciousness, at least at the very end, a minute or two. But yeah, if we feel more comfortable with stillness or silence right now, those could be our primary focus for the time being as well. Observation number 3, it made me feel more verdant inside. Yeah, and that's a beautiful experience to have already that green freshness within us. I mean, totally natural. I think that the very fact that we feel refreshed when we are doing forest bathing, as the Japanese call it, um, comes from um, this intricate interconnection between the vitality and vibrancy of nature and the inherent vibrant nature of our own mind. Deep within us, there's that boundless, verdant quality, indeed. That's totally valid. Kind of that vibrancy, that aliveness, that clarity. And yes, the natural world can help us access it. And we need it, actually. We need to have a balanced relationship with the rest of the natural world. But we can also access it in our inner lab. And ideally, we would do both. So perfectly valid. Yeah. Next observation here, I felt grounded and glimpses of peace and bliss. Yeah, as we're resting in these types of practices, slowly, slowly, some of the experiences associated with deep types of meditation might start emerging in little glimpses. For some people, calm, for some people, clarity, for some people, bliss, and just a moment of this here, a moment of that there. We're not focusing on those experiences with a desire to grasp at them, because this practice is teaching us to not grasp. This is a practice of non-grasping in a way, not grasping at anything in the long run. But if they appear as these beautiful sparks that inspire us further, that's wonderful, right? Right. So something to enjoy and ideally not grasp at. Very, very meaningful. The next one, I always find this practice very grounding and calming. I often practice it on its own, but can see how it is a wonderful preparation for just about anything. Absolutely, yeah. So when Dr. Alan Wallace teaches it, and he usually teaches it in terms of qualities of relaxation, stability, and clarity, and for the body, relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. For our mind, relaxation, stability, and clarity. Those are the same things, but just described in two different ways in English. And in Tibetan, actually, they would be the same words for all three. But when we're doing that, when he's teaching that practice using these three terms, he's always reminding us, well, is anything we could potentially do done better when we are tense, unstable, and lacking in clarity or dull? Or does every activity benefit from us being relaxed, still, meaning our mind is firmly focused on the object, stable, we could say, and clear? Well, obviously, sleeping, entertaining ourselves, talking to others, doing a crossword puzzle, anything, serving humanity, finding cure for cancer. All of these things would be done better if we're doing them from a state that's relaxed, stable, and clear. And this might, once again, wow, what a great thought, such novel thoughts, Lobsang. Wow. Thank you for doing this course. You're teaching us incredible ideas. Huh? It's like, it's better if we're relaxed, stable, and clear. But in the moment, we forget. Sometimes we can support each other by, in a hopefully inoffensive manner, helping those around us to reconnect to this deeper stillness without sounding preachy or like we're telling them what to do, go relax yourself, go meditate, you're neurotic right now. But um, it's true. We should go meditate if we are feeling this kind of neurotic energy within us. And it's for that reason that Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, when teaching this practice, says that we do fall under the influence of what he describes as pain body, pain speech, and pain mind, which can also be just described as neurotic patterns of bodily activity, neurotic patterns of verbal activity, and neurotic patterns of mental activity. So we do fall under the influence of these neurotic patterns. So when that happens, what can we do? Yes, there are many methods that we could use. Buddhism has famously 84,000 practices or teachings, many more in a way, but that's kind of just the mythological figure that we get. But amongst those methods, this one of profound letting go is a very elegant one and very helpful for other things. And here's a question in the chat. What does it mean to not grasp to the glimpses of bliss and calmness? Is not grasping here means no attachment, i.e., not wanting to prolong this experience? Yeah, exactly. It means not wanting to artificially prolong these experiences. And it also means not hoping that these experiences will reoccur, which can sometimes happen in our meditation. Let's say we have a good session and we do feel blissful. Sometimes people start feeling physical bliss in their body suddenly. Now, you were not expecting it, but just your body starts feeling really nice, or your mind feels really nice, or both. And then, if something felt really great, you might start wanting for that to happen again, which is natural. But the problem is with meditation, the more grasping, the the more problems, or the less it becomes less effective when there's grasping and expectations. So ideally, just reminding ourselves intellectually, it's like, yeah, I don't need to expect anything particular to happen. I just need to apply the key principles of practice, and whatever happens, happens. Yeah, if I feel bliss or no bliss, or even if I feel something temporarily problematic, like fear or shame or whatever, yeah, just letting it all pass through. Because the point of the practice is not to feel bliss, it's not to feel calm, and it's not to avoid fear or shame and so forth. It's just to settle more deeply. Yeah, great point. So, that's one way of tackling this first stage of soothing, or uh, our work on our personal field of experiences. And we could honestly unpack it through a number of other practices. We could have completely done the whole exploration through mainly working, let's say, with mindfulness of breathing, which is one of the practices that the Buddha taught most often, and one of the practices that are most popular in the world right now in terms of all the mindfulness-based modalities of training, MBSR, MBCT, all these different mindfulness programs. There are so many of them, and they're bringing so much benefit collectively. In all of those, the practice that's emphasized the most, and the practice that's present in all the great contemplative traditions of the world, including the Christian tradition, the Sufi tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness of breathing. Alan Wallace has a wonderful book called Mind in the Balance, which I've had the great joy of translating into Russian. And in it, the book is about meditation in science, Christianity, and Buddhism. So he goes into kind of a deep dive, sometimes into Christian mysticism, sometimes into the world of science and the study of meditation, and sometimes into Buddhism, primarily into Buddhism, honestly. But so when he's talking about mindfulness of breathing in one of the chapters, he's talking about how this practice can be very meaningful in different ways for followers of different traditions. So for a Christian, and that also applies to Judaism and Islam, probably, when you're focusing on your breath, you can remind yourself in the beginning that that's the very breath that God originally, reportedly, brought into humans. He breathed life into humans. So it's the same kind of movement of life that comes from before, through this lineage of ancestral transmission, from one generation to each other. That's kind of the vitality principle that originates with the moment of creation. So within the Christian worldview, one can inspire themselves to practice through this. And then from a Buddhist point of view, you can use a different idea to inspire yourself. And then in a Taoist view, it would be something else. But there are so many wonderful ways to inspire yourself to do this practice, including completely secular ones that have to do with a biological feedback between our breath and our emotional uh, experiences and our nervous system and so forth. So we could unpack this whole principle of soothing just looking at that practice or another practice. But the main point is finding a method that works for us and helping us tame the three fires, relax our body, speech, and mind, replenish our energy when it comes to the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual, and so forth. And with that, we'll be more prepared to work with a second kind of level or layer of reality, and that is the collective level. So when we were talking about the collective level last time, we talked about how this is where we start recognizing, or we remind ourselves. Ideally, we always recognize that, but this is where we remind ourselves, I am just one of however many human beings, 8 billion, let's say. And on top of that, there are endless billions upon billions of other sentient beings just on this planet alone. Insects and animals, and animals that live in the sea, animals that live on land, animals that fly, so many different types of beings all over, not to mention the miniature beings that we can't perceive with our eyes, and kind of the mysterious beings that we um, might know very little about. We're still very much expanding our biological knowledge, discovering multiple species in the depths of the ocean, uh, where there's very little light, and that for that reason we know very little about what's happening down there. But we know there's a profusion of life out there. And then from a Buddhist point of view, that's kind of a thing that uh, we can also start contemplating very carefully if we want. From a Buddhist point of view, there are also beings that have a different type of body, and for that reason, they're not visible to us, but they definitely do exist, and they share this space with us. And this is where the indigenous spiritual traditions speak about what in English we refer to as spirits, so the different invisible presences and beings that, just like us, are not enlightened. They're suffering and they have moments of happiness, but they're just different forms that consciousness temporarily assumes. Yeah. So from a Buddhist point of view, that's also important. If we are more on the secular side of things right now, the secular side of things that doesn't want to consider those things, that's also fine. There's already so much to think about with regards to humans and animals alone. But thinking about all of those and recognizing how, well, I'm not the only one who wants to live and prosper. So kind of in this, the famous Star Trek quote of live long and prosper, I'm not the only one who is deserving of that. And I'm not the only being that wants to live long and prosper. There are so many others around me. So unless I want to remain a self-centered egomaniac, which is kind of what many cultures in the world inspire us to be, focus on your own happiness, your own fulfillment at the exclusion of others. Unless I want to really be that, which is a very sad way of existing, sad way to exist, maybe I do want to develop at least some levels of empathy and kindness and compassion. So I want to clearly see other beings and recognize them as beings that have feelings and so forth, and also see the global interdependence that unites us. And on an emotional level, or kind of on the level of feelings, I want to offer some warmth. So this is where we start working with the principles of wisdom and compassion in the collective domain. And with regards to wisdom, we are training in clearly seeing other beings and the differing dynamic processes that unfold in their reality and in our shared reality. We can contemplate, for example, the effect that our actions have on others. We can contemplate the effect that our actions have on the shared culture that unites us. We can contemplate the effects of our actions on, let's say, the environmental processes in a specific community, or cultural processes, or economic processes, and so forth within a specific community. And that strengthens the wisdom quality. And then for the kindness aspect, and that includes compassion and kindness and tenderness and empathetic joy and equanimity, the whole range of wonderful qualities that Buddhism talks about so much. On this side of things, we can train in the associated practices of loving kindness and so forth. And Buddhism has these incredibly clear instructions on how to train in those. That's my favorite topic, my main specialty, both as a translator and as a quote unquote instructor of stuff who facilitates classes sometimes. I think that's the best thing I can offer, kind of translations related to that topic, whereas many people focus on other things, and that's incredible. That's wonderful. But with regards to these in the EcoDharma domain, I think one thing that we can slowly work to overcome, and that's not often mentioned, not always mentioned when loving kindness practices and so forth are taught. One thing that we can work to overcome is our human centricity, anthropocentricity, when we are training in loving kindness and we're gradually extending into more and more beings, but somehow we always only extend it to humans. And in a way, it's valid to focus on humans because even with humans, we have problems. We have it's difficult to offer loving kindness, even to humans. But the problem is, if we only focus on humans and we exclude all the other species, we will probably miss this window of opportunity where we could still do something about the global extinction that our human activity is causing right now. So to try and not miss that window of opportunity, we do need to kind of step up and start extending compassion and loving kindness to other species right now. And ideally, not right now, but like 30 years ago or 300 years ago, but we do what we can. So that's about horizontal interspecies extension of loving kindness, compassion, and so forth. And the other one that we were talking about is temporal. We are living in this day and age, and a number of generations are coexisting on this planet right now. But there are more generations coming after us. And, the generations that are just coming, becoming adults right now or growing as children and then teenagers and so forth right now, they will inherit the earth once my generation is gone, the previous generations are gone, and so forth. It's also valid to extend loving kindness and compassion in this temporal dimension, wishing for freedom and for happiness for those who are yet to come. The Buddha also mentioned that in his first teaching on loving kindness, where he mentioned that we're extending loving kindness to those born and those yet to be born. So that's kind of another thing that we can focus on. And not yet to be born does not only mean those who are currently in the womb. It also means everyone's who's still just a draft right now in terms of, they are potentially present there in the genetic material and they will come and live on this planet if the planet is still inhabitable by then. So we can train in that. So let's just do a tiny bit of that. We'll focus now on the horizontal expansion, kind of across species. And just as a reminder, and that kind of helps us with the seeing part, which is the main keyword I like to use for this collective domain. So stretching, moving around a little bit, doing a tiny victory dance if we feel like it, and then arriving at a comfortable stationary position for the meditation. And so, assuming a comfortable stationary position and bringing our awareness into the body. Noticing the sensations associated with the earth element that's holding us right now, and allowing these experiences of firmness, stability, steadiness to gradually expand across our body, bringing in relaxation and a deep sense of rest. For a very short while, we can focus on our highest aspirations for contemplative practice in general, just revisiting our highest goals that we would like all of our practices to contribute to. Thinking, may this practice contribute to the realization of those goals as well. Then, for the actual practice of loving kindness, first using ourselves as an example, bringing our awareness to ourselves as a being, and recognizing the fact that this very being present here wants to be happy and does not want to suffer. Also, this very being has an ability to transform its mind, to transform its behavior, and therefore to create causes for happiness, causes for greater well being. There's this amazing transformative potential deep within all of us. So, since creating causes for greater well being is a possibility, and since that's what we want deep inside, totally valid to generate a wish for happiness and well being. And that is the definition of loving kindness, wishing for happiness and for the causes of happiness, for happiness and for the causes of happiness to manifest for one being, a group of beings, or all beings. So for ourselves, we can start wishing, may I be happy and have the causes of happiness. Generating the wish and resting in its meaning, and then generating it again and again and again, and resting in this flow. May I be happy and have the causes of happiness. And then thinking that there are many other beings who also want to be happy and not to suffer. In fact, all beings capable of feeling happiness and unhappiness, pleasure and pain, want the same thing for themselves. So even inside of our building or in the little spot that we're occupying right now, if we're somewhere outside, all the beings around us, including humans, animals, insects, and so forth, want to be happy. So, with an understanding that we can all, to a certain degree, progress towards greater happiness, especially if we think in terms of the long term perspective and adopt the Buddhist view of multiple lifetimes, even though in this case it's not strictly necessary. With a recognition of that and with the understanding that opening our heart will also make us feel happier, we can extend the wish to this group of beings surrounding us. May we be happy and have the causes of happiness. Not limiting this to just humans alone. Then extending this field of loving kindness even more, perhaps to all the beings in the city, town, village, or locale that we are currently in. So many beings of different species. Well, may we all be happy and have the causes of happiness. And then all the beings on our continent. All the beings in our hemisphere. And that includes so many beings living in the ocean, obviously. May we all be happy and have the causes of happiness. And then just all beings in general, no longer qualifying it geographically, just extending loving kindness to all who live. May all beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. Then we let go of all the wishes and aspirations, all the images and ideas, and we just rest in spaciousness or an approximation of spaciousness. Then we come back to the body, grounding ourselves there. Mentally dedicating the energy of this practice to our highest aspirations. May it contribute to the realization of those. And then slowly concluding the practice as we introduce some movement to the body. Thank you. So that's seeing, revisiting the second kind of layer of outer and inner work here. Of course, outer work is supposed to flow out of the inner work. Once again, I love this quote by Thomas Merton about how action flows from the river of action flows from the spring of contemplation. So cognitive pre kind of predates the behavioral. We cultivate the view and the associated emotional states or kind of feeling states or wishing states in the case of loving kindness. And on the basis of this mental activity, verbal and physical activity occurs as well. And that includes our institutionalized activity, that includes our collective activity. Yeah, everything we do collectively and individually stems from what's in our mind. That's the fundamental Buddhist view. Mind is the precursor to all. That's a famous statement that the Dhammapada begins with. And so by transforming our attitude, we could say, towards beings and environments and so forth, we transform our action then. But we can also look at the action more directly. So we still have that to cover, and we have about 57 minutes left because these classes are meant to be approximately 2.5 hours long. So let's take a 5-minute bio break to just, stretch, go to the bathroom, dance a little bit, and then we'll reconvene in 5 minutes to cover the last bit, the one that has to do with global activity. So we'll see each other in 5 minutes, but please take good care of your body and see you soon. Thank you. So welcome back. And while we're slowly moving on to the global dimension of our eco-dharmic work, I would still invite you, if you have a moment, to share how the practice of kind of interspecies or intergenerational loving kindness makes you feel, since we've done the same thing with the practice of settling our body, speech, and mind. Yeah, just if you want to share some experiences in the chat, or just your general attitude towards this practice, whether you find it difficult or easy, nice or complicated, inspiring or, not particularly inspiring, whatever it is that arises for you. Yeah, if you want to share that in the chat, I would be grateful, and it would be nice to see that. But while that's happening, I'll slowly start unpacking our next dimension. And so these, once again, keywords, they're just coming from my side. So they're not particularly important. If they don't feel relevant, don't use them. So this idea of soothing for the personal domain, seeing for the collective domain, and then supporting for the global domain, they work for me. They're just a summary that I find helpful, kind of a very quintessential, pithy reminder. But if they don't work for you, it's totally fine. These are my thoughts. You don't have to use them. What I would use, though, are some of those more time-tested keywords that we've discussed in the past. So in the very first meeting, we talked at length about being calm and clear, kind and helpful. And that's a fourfold schema that Chokyamuni Rinpoche presents. It's kind of a summary for all the quintessential practices that we do on the path, or the 4 quintessential qualities that we cultivate. Being calm and clear is a bit more on the wisdom side. Well, calm is universal. Clear is on the wisdom side, and then kind and helpful is the more on the compassion side. So you could say, well, with those qualities, yes, everything we do will become transformed, especially if we start actively looking at the EcoDharma domain. So we can use that, or we could just focus on wisdom and compassion, where compassion includes all the different types of kindness, and where wisdom includes all the different types of common sense. In particular, the common sense that sees the nature of reality that is interdependent, sees interdependence as the nature of reality. We could focus on that. These are all quintessential presentations of the Dharma, but they're all equally applicable to eco-Dharma, not just Dharma in general, not just the liberating Dharma, the Dharma that leads to awakening and liberation. So we could use we could work with any of those. But I'm still using this threefold schema of soothing, supporting, and soothing, seeing, and supporting, just because it helps me to see how to apply wisdom and compassion to each of these 3 domains: personal, collective, and global. So one of the observations from the chat regarding the loving kindness practice, I love these dimensions to loving kindness practice. With the horizontal, I find myself just trying to fathom the amount of beings, and I think I forget to wish them happiness a lot of time. Yeah, absolutely. And once again, I think it is not necessarily intuitive to those of us who grew up in a Western culture, at least, to think of so many different kinds of beings, just because we live in a very human-centered, civilization. And without sounding too naive about it, I would say yes, that the indigenous cultures naturally, culturally, uh, attended and still attend, where they still remain intact to a certain degree, to the multiplicity of beings. So actually, for the Tibetan culture, which had its own indigenous tradition of bone, and then adopted Buddhism, which shares many of the same principles of respect towards multiple types of beings. In Tibetan culture, up until 1959, and then well, the occupation of Tibet, and then the Cultural Revolution that swept across Tibet and China. Up until that point, people really thought of other beings a lot, and not just visible beings like animals, birds, and so forth, and insects, but also invisible beings where it was just natural to think, oh, this is a spring or a river, so there must be some Naga beings, these invisible, most of the time at least, they're invisible serpent-like beings that are kind of like mermaids associated with the water element. So I better behave myself when I'm dealing with this aspect of the natural environment because I don't want to harm them or anger them. And actually, if you travel across Nepal or here in Mexico as well, you see many reminders of the presence of Nagas, or at least many reminders of the fact that these cultures historically thought a lot about Nagas and how to not ruin the relationship with them. So that's not something that necessarily comes naturally for many of us. I grew up in the post-Soviet cultural space. That was not a great place for thinking of Nagas as in like no one did that. But even with other types of beings, with animals and so forth, the view was that, yeah, they're kind of nice, but most of them are there to be eaten or to be put in a zoo. Yeah, it's nice if they're out there, but you know, we don't have to be too concerned about their well-being. Well, now it turns out we do because the global extinction is underway. So for sure. Uh, the next observation, I like to dual practices of the four immeasurables. I find them a useful way to relate to other beings, especially for difficult ones. Yes, absolutely. For me, the four immeasurables are such a huge source of inspiration. And one reason is that they do transform our emotional landscape very strongly. And the other reason is that they do very strongly include or potentially include many other aspects of the path. So wisdom practices can be woven into the four immeasurables. Um, Different types of concentration practices can be done on the basis of the four immeasurables. And for people who are into other aspects of Buddhist Dharma, Vajrayana practices can be woven into the four immeasurables as well. Nature of the mind practices can be woven into the four immeasurables. Ethics are very naturally connected to the four immeasurables. So pretty much everything in the Buddhist path, in one way or another, can be connected to the four immeasurables. So for me, that's kind of my favorite aspect to look at and then to see how it connects to everything else. Yeah. And just how we feel after doing this practice. This is really a very significant thing as well. Um, these are the so-called feel-good practices, and it is often emphasized that not everything we do on the dharmic paths has to be a feel-good practice. Contemplating death is not a feel-good practice, but it's a necessary practice for many of us, just helping us come closer to reality, the reality of impermanence. The contemplation of impermanence in general is not a feel-good practice. The contemplation of suffering is not a feel-good practice. And so having some practices that are feel good, like the four immeasurables, helps us balance it out. We don't want to only do feel good practices, but also we don't want to go on to the extreme of only doing practices that make us sad. We need to balance it out. One side would help us with being more realistic. The other side would make us feel good while still remaining realistic. So basically, uh, there's a fine dance there that can be explored. The next observation, during this meditation and other meditations on loving kindness, I felt some tightness in my chest. Sometimes it's even painful. I wonder why that happens. Well, I mean, one thing to be generally on the lookout for in all of the practices of the four immeasurables is to make sure that while we're wishing for happiness and for the causes of happiness, our wishing is not making us tense up physically. or energetically for those who are more sensitive towards this energetic domain that's in between the physical and the mental. Um, so if we can relax even more deeply on a physical level, if we can make sure that our breath is flowing even more naturally, as effortlessly as possible, that would make sure that some of these side effects are less likely to occur. So the deeper our relaxation, the better it would be. So that's one thing. Sometimes these side effects that can be a bit bothersome arise because there's still something tensing up within us. Sometimes just because we're overexcited. And that's okay, but gradually deepening that quality of relaxation, maybe by working with it directly through doing body scan practices, settling body, speech, and mind, and all these other things. Some gentle mindfulness of breathing across the entire body, working with it to lay that foundation of profound relaxation. So that's one thing. Energetically, this is more with regards to the movement of nervous energies in our body. We can also benefit from some practices that help us balance our nervous system and our energy system. And so there are many of those different breathing techniques and different practices for affecting the flow of nervous energies in our body. So in Why We Meditate, Tsoknyi Rinpoche describes a very gentle form of vase breathing, for example. Vase breathing is a whole system of different practices in which we work with our abdominal area to harmonize and to control our nervous energy. Some of the more advanced forms of this practice are used to, once again, connect to our deepest nature or to experience powerful types of bliss that we can use to cultivate wisdom and so forth. But those are the more advanced forms. The more basic forms, and these are the forms that he presents in the book, can be used more to just settle down, release tension, and to make sure that these unnecessary types of tensing up do not occur. So we can play with those very, very gently and following his instructions very carefully. So as not to step into the domain of too much control, which can then be uh, counterproductive. And then the third thing is that if still as a side product, just some tensing up occurs, if it's just a side thing that's occurring, once again, not grasping onto it, not being too worried about it. Yeah, well, whatever, the lighter our attitude to it, the less likely it is that it will be a stable thing that keeps occurring. So by just noticing it, then letting it go, being like, okay, whatever, and mainly focusing on the practice itself from a place of relaxation, we're more likely to then eventually lose that side effect. So thank you all for sharing. Very inspiring to see how these two practices, settling body, speech, and mind, and then loving kindness, feel for you. And I think for those who are watching this as a recording or haven't shared anything in the chat, there's could be a journaling exercise, just a little journaling thing to reflect on how all of these practices make us feel now, and then to reflect on it 6 months later, and then just to see what's the dynamic there, and to basically be witnessing, serve as a witness to our own experiences. So the third domain has to do with a global plane of reality. Global meaning uniting us all of the beings living on this very globe, this very planet, which is not flat, just as a reminder. I'm really fascinated by the fact that there are actually people who do genuinely start believing it's flat. Well, fascinating, but the term global comes from the fact that we live in a globe, right? And so living on this globe, we are witnessing currently that there are many things that are going wrong in the environmental field, not just going wrong with, let's say, the decisions by policymakers. Of course, that's one global thing that is in many countries is not really going too well. And if we look at the discrepancy between what is it that environmental scientists and environmental activists suggest and what is it that policymakers actually codify as policies. We'd see that there's a huge divide there. So that is one thing that we can focus on, and that is one aspect of the global plane. And then another thing we could focus on is the thing that environmental scientists are focused on, which is how are the processes in the ecosphere unfolding? Are they still working in the way that they were working 500 years ago or even 50 years ago? Or are there some major unexpected, unpleasant shifts that are happening? And having lived in Nepal, where things are changing at a very rapid pace, I can definitely, I have no reasons at all to doubt that the shifts we are experiencing are very powerful and not at all beneficial. So then what do we do with this? How do we bring in some transformation? Well, a simple answer, and this is kind of the pithy part of it. We could talk about this for days or for weeks or for years, honestly, in a more expanded way. And you would find more expansive explanations in the books that I referenced at the very beginning as the suggested reading for this course, and also in pretty much any and all environmentalism related courses. I will, at the end of our session today, suggest one such course that you can explore. It's free and it is well, available to all. And it even provides you with a little certificate if that's something that you're interested in. And then that takes you through, once again, some of the principles that we discussed and also the environmental science associated with it. But for now, both because we're limited in time and because I think there is benefit in having something pithy that we can practice. But now, just focusing on this dual presentation of two things that we can focus on in order to start bringing in some transformation. So internally, kind of on the level of our view, or on the cognitive level, we could say, we could work on the greening of the self. Once again, that's a concept from Joanna Macy, and it refers to a shift in our self-perception, in how we perceive our identity and how we perceive our sense of selfhood. And that's a shift in which we extend it we change it, we transform it basically to feel like we are a part, an inalienable part in a way, of the natural world, um, which means that what we do affects the natural world, and whatever is happening to the natural world will very deeply affect us. And not only that, beyond that, also feeling that we are in this historical age called, invited by the natural world itself to be protectors of the natural world, to serve as its guardians, its custodians, in a good way, finally in a good way, not as the quote unquote custodians that would come in and cut down all the trees and burn the land, not as custodians that would extract everything that there is and then live this planet dry and move to Mars, which is kind of the fantasy that some of the billionaires have, but rather as custodians that would serve the balance so that this planet is still green and blue and inhabitable and alive in 500 years, in 5,000 years, in 50,000 years. So feeling that we are not simply individualized bubbles as beings, we're not just simply isolated kind of little plastic figures that come in those chocolate eggs, and you crack the egg and then you eat it and then you open the little thing inside and there's this little figurine in there. So we're not that in our little yellow plastic egg, and also covered by a layer of chocolate and divided from everything else, but rather we are a system that's made of these temporary physical threads of reality and also made of our own mental threads. And we're a system that's always connected to all the other systems. So we are about, in reality, we are about as connected to the rest of reality as, let's say, a mushroom in a forest. As the mushroom is not simply connected to the root system that gives rise to all the individual mushrooms. The mushrooms that we, let's say, forage for, that we collect, are simply kind of like a very limited extension of this vast thing that's hidden underground. So we're not simply connected to this one thing underground. We're intimately connected to the wholeness of the forest environment. And we're actually existing in equilibrium with the rest of the forest. And we're actually existing, and that's something that science is learning more and more about, we're actually existing in a mutually supportive relationship with each other. So there are these now wonderful insights on how, for example, trees can provide sustenance to each other, and how informational signals can be transmitted across systems in the forest, and lots of stuff that a proper researcher of these things would be able to describe in much greater detail. But from my side, as someone who's focused on the contemplative side of things, what I'm saying here is that we can use our contemplative practice and also our learning, our reading, our journaling, our discussions with each other, our forest bathing. All of these activities can be brought together and used to perform gradually, step by step, this greening of the self. Someone might ask, well, wouldn't that stand in the way of us becoming enlightened uh, on the Buddhist path? Because wouldn't that just replace one sense of identity with another sense of identity? And isn't the idea to go beyond all identities and see through them and experience no self? No, actually, most Buddhist paths teach us to start by transforming our sense of self into something that is more wholesome. And then eventually we are invited to see through all senses of identity. But we're never invited to see through all senses of identity and then get stuck in nihilism. Eventually, when we arrive at the really advanced stages of training in the view and the correct view of reality, the correct view of reality is described as the union of conventional and ultimate. So ultimately, yes, we'll look through all potential types of identification. But conventionally, we still need a healthy conventional view of the conventional selves. And one might argue, and that's very much the argument of EcoDharma, and all of the Tibetan Buddhist teachers that I've worked with have stressed this as well in the environmental domain. Conventionally speaking, a sense of self that is deeply connected to all the systems of interdependence, that sense of self is a much healthier conventional sense of self to have than this isolated sense of self that's wrapped in plastic and feels that it's separate from the rest of the conventional world. So a greening of the self is in itself actually a process that will help us with our exploration of ultimate reality later, because in order to perform the greening of the self, we need to let go of some of our reification, as it's described, our grasping at the independence of something. To feel that we are a part of the natural world, we need to let go of some of our cultural and individual grasping at our independence. And that will already weaken our tendency to grasp and to reify. And that would lead to then us also succeeding in the ultimate, highest practices of seeing through kind of identity grasping in general. So, there's only benefit here. Of course, theoretically, someone could get stuck in the conventional sense of being a part of the natural world and not being able to see through that. But that should be the least of our concerns because, first of all, there's no indication that that's ever happened. And second of all, where most of us are still so far from having a truly green self that um, it will be years, if not decades, of training before we even face that problem. And then, if we're aware of that problem potentially occurring, we'll be able to deal with it very easily. But to prematurely think, oh no, if I perform the greening of the self, that will cut me off from enlightenment, is a little bit of a ridiculous argument that also ignores the fact that without the greening of the self, there will be no green planet to practice on, and there will be no enlightenment because, well, at least on this planet, because the planet will be fully uninhabitable. So if people want to believe that they'll go to Mars and get enlightened there, well, that's a thing that could be considered, but I don't think it's a very realistic plan that is very likely to succeed. And it's not definitely not likely to succeed for that many beings in terms of how many are going to be living there on Mars if ever that happens at all. So a much more realistic strategy is to green ourselves, protect this planet, keep it inhabitable, and then get enlightened right here, which will be actually easier if we do perform the greening of the self. And then if we perform even a tiny bit of this greening of the self thing, even if we move 1% or like one tiny step towards feeling a bit more green, it's in that we've improved our understanding of interdependence by 1%, by one tiny step, and then by one tiny step more, and then by one tiny step more, still, that would start inevitably leading us to green action. So it would start leading us to the types of activity that are more essentially environmentally friendly, is the term that we used to say. But in this case, I would not even use the term friendly. It's not about friendliness. Environmentally restorative, maybe, is a better term here. Because it's not just about being friendly, it's kind of like harming, but not too much, or not harming. We are at the stage where just not harming is not enough. We also need to actively or proactively restore whatever we can restore. And there are so many wonderful things to explore in that regard, offered by experts who are working in that field, and also by individuals who are just enthusiastic activists and supporters, maybe on a more mundane level and with less scope to their activity, but still very actively in a very committed way. So when it comes to the specifics of green action, this is where we do need to ideally keep ourselves informed with regards to what is it that's currently available in terms of this domain of action, and what is it what we can do, because that will keep expanding our toolkit of green action. There are many things that could be done at any given moment, and we're probably already aware of many of those. So in some cases, it means letting go of something. Many people know that one of the greenest things we can do, one of the most environmentally friendly things that we can do, is to reduce our consumption of animal products. It's not an easy thing for many people, and some people start offering a lot of very emotionally heated arguments against that as soon as they hear that. And I understand where that's coming from, but in terms of the environmental science, that's just a fact. So, well, how we feel about it is a different question. And we can unpack our own feelings and look at them and see what thoughts are valid, what thoughts are not valid. Do I need to believe this? Do I need to believe that? Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel that way? It's a complex type of work that's doable, and doable collectively or individually. Then another thing, obviously, we could do is transform our attitude towards, let's say, the consumption of fashion products, and to change our relationship with that, to change our relationship with other types of consumption, including media consumption and so forth, or even the search engines that we use. People would know that there are search engines that are internet search engines that are very destructive to the planet in terms of the environmental cost of using them. And then there are search engines that try to be committed, to remain committed to environmental restoration. And in between those are those that are just less harmful in terms of the energy and water resources that they consume. So even on that level, wow, there are options. So this is with regards to potentially letting go of something or shifting our habits. And then there are many, many restorative practices that have to do, for example, with planting forests and not monoculture forests, but multicultural forests, so that it's an actual self-sustaining, balanced ecosystem and not just a bunch of trees that are simply grown to be cut down and reused, and then grown again and cut down and reused, but that are extremely prone to fires, that are extremely vulnerable to fires, because monoculture forests are not true forests in the original sense of that word. They're just a farm for trees, which is very different from an actual forest that is self-sustaining and self-balancing. Some communities, including Upaya in New Mexico, Roshijo in Halifax's community, run regular annual and in some cases quarterly events on different facets of, let's say, food justice. So Upaya actually has this wonderful program that they regularly run on seed justice and food justice related to that. Seed justice is a push for a just and people well, let's just basically say it for a just treatment of seeds that we use to plant food and just to create plants in general. And it's a push against the monopoly of such global companies as Monsanto and others that are trying to hold rights, legal rights to the seed bank that we as humanity operate on the basis of. So these companies are pushing very hard to, first of all, have legal rights to the seeds and the creation of different types of seeds, pushing against the indigenous plant types and agricultural technologies that historically have proven to be extremely sustainable as opposed to the more modern farming technologies that are in use today, especially by the mega corporations, as opposed to individual farming. So then there's this movement, human movement for reconnecting to the indigenous agricultural practices that are sustainable and restorative in nature. And there's also a push for using the old seeds, all types of seeds, like the ones that were used by the indigenous populations of North America, let's say, because it is those seeds that are actually probably much more sustainable and that already have proven to work well in cooperation. People probably have heard about this technology of planting the three sisters together, which was used by the indigenous tribes that used to be the main custodians for the country that we know as for the piece of land that's occupied by the United States of America. And also coming back to that and seeing how can that fit into our modern agricultural processes. There are Buddhist communities running courses on that and seminars and conferences and discussions. So looking into that and constantly learning something new, constantly learning, oh, there's this thing that's called seed bombs that could be used in large cities to create like this explosive little patches where lots of things grow. Learning about this thing, that thing, this technology, this type of action is something that we can use to expand our green action. But beyond that, and here's where we're coming back to the contemplative side. Between these two things, between the greening of the self and green action, there is a wonderful contemplative principle of what Buddhists would refer to as karmic mindfulness, or mindfulness of our karma, mindfulness of our action, and the consequences of our action. In a secular context, once again, we don't necessarily use the term karma. And karma is not just the consequences of our actions in the here and now. Karma describes also how our actions bring consequences in the long run because our actions leave imprints in our mind, and then those imprints eventually ripen as certain compulsions that we experience. So Buddhist theory of karma is more about that. But in Buddhism, there is this suggestion, sometimes emphasized, sometimes not particularly emphasized, depending on which source we're looking at. But there's generally this suggestion to try and practice strong watchfulness. That's a term from Khandro Rinpoche. Strong watchfulness with regards to our activity. What this means is, instead of being just aware of our breath, or instead of just being aware of the sensations in our body or the thoughts in our mind, which are all very helpful types of mindfulness or very helpful applications of mindfulness, what if we were to also train in being extremely and strongly aware of everything that we do, our reasons for doing it, and the potential consequences of whatever it is that we're doing? So being powerfully aware of our actions, the causes for our actions, and the results of our actions. And on a basic level of Buddhist training, this helps us with establishing strong levels of ethical intelligence and ethical balance. In the more advanced stages, this type of work, inner work, awareness work, helps us to create positive causality that would expand our options for being happy and having the causes of happiness. And in a way, some masters describe it as an indispensable type of training that in the West is just less fashionable than meditation, but is equally important, if not more so, at the foundational levels of training, at least. So I've heard that in the past in different quotes from, for example, Lama Thupten Yeshe, who was the founder of the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, the founder of Kolpun Monastery, and he's played a huge role in establishing Buddhism in the West, and established many communities, even in the United States, like Vajrapani Institute, Land of Medicine Buddha, and many others. So, and he was also known as advanced yogi, who taught from a very pithy perspective. Instead of teaching elaborate philosophical texts, which he did on occasion, he primarily offered people these pith instructions for how to transform their mind. And one thing that he did teach very powerfully and in a very clear way was this karmic awareness. In some cases, he used to say that, well, meditation is fancy and we'll like meditation. And he was addressing the hippie generation, essentially. And that's all good. But for some, would be even more important or more beneficial to just be relentlessly aware of our actions and the consequences of our actions. This type of karmic awareness, karmic watchfulness, to develop that, to truly, truly powerfully cultivate that. That's an incredible thing. Would be incredible thing for our Buddhist practice, if we want to get enlightened eventually or get a good rebirth and so forth. And it would be incredible for our EcoDharma practice, because that's the, in a way, ecological intelligence that Daniel Goleman wrote a book about, but did not unpack, I think, very thoroughly. That's his worst book for sure, in my personal opinion, because in that book, he only focuses on kind of the individual aspect of it, saying like, well, you have to be aware of your carbon footprint and da. And that's very important. But many people now know that the very concept of carbon footprint was created by carbon industry, by the carbon industry, the fossil fuel industry, primarily to push the responsibility onto the individuals and to conceal the fact that while individual dimensions matter incredibly so, the biggest polluters on the planet are the great corporations. So while we are watching our carbon footprint and recycling and doing all of these necessary things, which are very important, we also need to think of different ways of acting that would pressure these big organizations and communities that arise as the crystallizations of the three fires, crystallizations of greed primarily. We need to find ways to push these crystallized forms of greed to transform and change, or to dissolve, if that's available, if that's possible. So being karmically watchful with regards to all the action that we're taking does involve this level of personal responsibility, and how well am I recycling? How well am I maintaining a non-harmful lifestyle, and so forth? That's very important. But also at every step asking ourselves, and what types of actions can I do to affect these large players, these large elements of our global system, because the primary onus of responsibility lies with them. But they will never change unless they're pressured through monetary issues or political issues and so forth. And this is where there are also wonderful types of actions that are available. Boycotting, for example, production companies that still follow unethical principles and are not producing it in an environmentally aware manner, or maybe they're doing greenwashing, but they're not actually doing something that's sustainable. I'm not going to give examples just to stay, well, also for shortness of time. But if we start looking into those issues and we even Google like what businesses are truly environmentally ethical, what businesses are only doing greenwashing, and so forth, we will see a profusion of information from credible sources. And that will help us once again make practical decisions and implement that karmic watchfulness, kind of in the way that we do. And yes, it is a little bit of a pain in the ass, to be fair, because then we have to get selective. Oh, let's not get coffee from this place. Let's get coffee from that place. Oh, let's not buy any more of this because I have enough t-shirts to last me 10 years. Let's not just like there are minor sacrifices that we're making. But there's also joy built in that because from a Buddhist psychological point of view, doing what's right creates a type of happiness that's sometimes referred to as the joy of clear conscience. That's actually the most basic type of inner well-being that's available to us, having the joy of clear conscience. Just knowing, yes, I am truly trying to practice these ethical principles, and I am working to strengthen my ethical intelligence with each week, each month, each year. I'm making it stronger and stronger through actively learning about this stuff. So a greening of the self leading to green action. And the connecting element, the connecting agent between the two is this action watchfulness, action-oriented watchfulness, karmic watchfulness, we could say, being aware of our actions, their psychological and cultural causes. Like, am I doing this under the influence of greed? Am I doing this under the influence of neurotic attachment? Am I doing this because someone convinced me to through incessant targeted advertising? Or am I doing this because it's truly wise and helpful? And then on the other side, what are the consequences? We might not think that, just buying coffee there once would have an effect, or, watching this new show would have an effect. But then because all of us watched that show, this truly wild person got billions of dollars out of it. Then they're using for something really bad, incredibly bad, actually. Or this business got, because we all bought a coffee that costs $2, this business got billions of dollars, and then they're using it for something that's incredibly destructive. So recognizing that these things do matter, and we can, from a space of joy, approach this watchful thing, not from a space of pain and lack and suffering, but from a space of joy, and trying to find that sense of joy through all of our joy-related practices. So one thing that I would like to invite you to do is another meditation. And this is not a meditation that we would necessarily be doing all the time. Not like the previous ones. The previous ones we can really train in on a daily basis or in retreat. This one is not this kind of practice, but it's helpful to do it every once in a while. So it's just an imagination exercise. And we can do it formally or informally. So if you don't feel like, you know, um, crossing your legs and, you know, lying down or relaxing very deeply in this moment, you don't have to do any of those. You can just close your eyes and dream. Or if you want to assume a formal kind of inner posture and outer posture to do it as a formal meditation, that's also very good. But just for a moment, relaxing, letting go, just preparing ourselves for a teeny tiny visionary journey. And then imagining, what would it be like for me to undergo this greening of the self process on a deep level, extensively? How would it feel, and what would it look like for me to always consistently feel like I'm a part of the natural world, strongly connected to all the other elements of the ecosphere? Always profoundly feeling my connection to all the other sentient beings and to the systems that sustain us. How would I feel, and how would I act? Imagining that. And What would it be like to live in a community of beings, in a country full of beings, in a city full of beings, where everyone has that green self, where everyone feels connected to the rest of the natural world and acts accordingly, where no one is so blinded by greed that they're destroying the world, but rather everyone is contributing to the greater balance and sustainability of it all. And what if we were able to create a world in which everyone, in one way or another, has that green awareness? So no matter where we travel, everyone is harmoniously connected to nature. And all the business practices, all the political practices, everything has been transformed to be in accordance with that green awareness. If this vision is something that we find appealing, we can add a wish to it, activating our cognitive abilities, our ability to wish, to aspire, to dream, to plan. Just wishing, may it come to pass. May we move closer and closer and closer to this green world. And may each self, starting with mine, become greener and greener and greener, with wisdom and compassion growing in the hearts of all and then being expressed through action. And this is where we can end the exercise, coming back to the space around us. So, one thing to add to all of this is that it's very important when doing these types of visionary exercises or this type of work or contemplating EcoDharma in general or the Dharma of social justice and so forth. One thing to very important that's very important is not to subscribe to a limited view of what's possible. So Professor Thurman, as the founder of Tibet House, he very often emphasizes that we don't have to believe that the solutions are limited. In fact, it's very important to open up to the idea that there are boundless solutions waiting for us. We might not see them yet, but they're there. And this attitude, by the way, is very different from the attitude of thinking, oh, well, someone will step in and save us at the last moment. That's for EcoDharma not helpful, actually counterproductive. Thinking aliens will arrive and save us, or this billionaire will save us. Well, they could if they wanted to, but they've proven again and again that they don't want to. They'd rather build bunkers. So we don't have to think that someone from the outside will come and save us, even though, of course, there are sources of support coming from, let's say, the enlightened beings all over. It's rather feeling that the infinity of solution is within us as people and the rest of the natural world as well. But it's people who need to come to their senses. So this is a principle that's sometimes described in the Wiccan tradition, actually, principle of the infinity of solutions. Also helpful for thinking of our own problems. We sometimes think, oh, if only I could get this job or kind of win over this person or get that degree or that degree. And then we're kind of reminded that sometimes the best thing is not that, it's something else. But that best thing will actually fulfill our emotional needs much better than this limited outer thing that we were focused on to the level of obsession. So kind of remembering this infinity of solutions and slowly progressing towards the greening of the self and then the greening of the action. So this, of course, is an endlessly fascinating topic, at least for me. So I wish we had more time to talk about it. And maybe we'll one day, when the interest is slightly stronger, we'll be able to organize a longer EcoDharma course again. But until then, I'll just leave you with two very simple suggestions. If you don't know where to start in terms of green action and you're not quite sure what to focus on, there are many ways to looking into what's necessary, even in my local area, thinking, oh, what types of activity are the most pressing right here? For some regions, it's water protection. For some regions, it's making sure that this new toxic factory is not built, yada, yada, yada. So we could start with the local news and see what's the most pressing need there. But if not, one suggestion from one of my teachers, Chekini Rinpoche, is it there? Oh, I don't have a slide for it. Oops. So his suggestion is kind of generating an inner aspiration to plant at least 25,000 plants in our lifetime, directly or indirectly, directly by planting them ourselves, indirectly by sponsoring them. So if we could sponsor 25,000 trees, that's a huge contribution. Imagine if every Buddhist on this planet, or at least every Buddhist that has some means, sponsored 25,000 trees. That's a lot of trees, and that's a transformative wave that could sweep across the planet. Yes, ideally not in monocultural forests, but in actual forests. In a sustainable way. So that's something we can explore. But even if not that, starting with a few plants on our windowsill or in our apartment, that's a start that would then potentially lead us to creating this more expansive, transformative thing. So that's something simple that we can start from, and then we can keep expanding it. But another thing that could be the next step now that we've discussed all of this is a course that I recommend. And as I've mentioned, it's freely available. You can make an offering for it, as it says here, from $1 to $108, or you can subscribe for free if you use this Access for All button. And it's a course that was developed by the Mind and Life Institute. Mind and Life Institute is the community that organizes the Mind and Life conferences, which are these major dialogues between Buddhist contemplatives and scientists. And that's a huge source of beneficial programs and approaches and principles and ideas that we're using here in Tibet House and in many other communities across the globe. So after one of these online conferences that Mind and Life organized on environmentalism, they gathered the materials and then transformed it into a course that can be done in just a couple of weeks or longer if you want to spread it out, or faster if you want to do it fast in a very prompt manner. But this is a course that gathers a lot of wonderful scientific thinkers and a lot of accomplished contemplatives such as Geshe Thupten Jinpa and some others, introducing a number of ideas that we can play with in our quest for a greening of the self and in our quest for green action. It presents some of the difficult points related to climate change, and it presents many of the wonderful points that we can focus in order to find hope and inspiration. So this can be, in addition to the books that we started the course with, that could be our next natural step in the EcoDharma exploration. And the more we all perform the greening of the self within us and within the people most immediately adjacent to us, the more hope we all have of this planet remaining blue and green, instead of transforming into something that's Mars-like. So let's pray for that and hope that everything that we've done together in this course will contribute to that goal. So let's rejoice in everything that we've done collectively and dedicate the energy of our time together to a true wave of greening within and greening on the level of our collective and global activity. May it bring benefit to all. From my side, deep bows of gratitude to all of you for bearing with me and for helping me record this course, which would hopefully bring some benefit in the long run once we release it openly as well. So eventually it will find its way to YouTube. So if you have friends and family members and so forth, they can access it in about 6 months from now. We'll release it on my YouTube channel, Michael Lobsang Tenpa. Yeah, and just deep bows of gratitude to all of you and to Zoya for hosting us. Thank you so much for doing this hard work. I hope there was some benefit in it all, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing all of you again if you choose to join our other events. We'll have a couple events on practice of Green Tara in June. One more as a webinar exploring the Atisha's legacy related to Tara. And another one is a meditation on Green Tara and her nature-related aspect. So that's also very EcoDharma adjacent. So if you want to join, we'll be happy to have you there as well. And for now, deep bows of gratitude. Sorry for keeping you for so long and hoping to see you all again. Thank you.